Okay. Okay. Let's play. Incredibly low. How is my voice over this music? Let me see if I can change the settings. Hello, hello. Okay, volume mix. That's what I need to do. Okay, that was from the aux to voice meter input. That's digital output. Okay. Does this sound good? I hope it does. But audio should be good so far. I hope I don't sound too blown out. Let me look at the properties. Let the moon bright and morning sky. So tell me where to put my love. No time to do what it does. Now tell me where to put my love. So tell me where to put my love. And wait for time to do what it does. Now tell me where to put my love. To put my love. I turned the gain down in the equalizer. That might be okay. Tell me where to put my love. Tell me where to put my love. Wait for time to do what it does. So tell me where to put my love. So tell me where to put my love. Do I wait for time to do what it does? So tell me where to put my love. I don't know where to put my love. C, 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 Trying to reduce my S's. S. Put this down just a little bit. S. Okay. That might be good for audio. Okay, this sounds good. Might turn the gain down just a tad. Okay, that might be okay. Do we want to do some reading to test this whole thing out? So I think the last thing we read was chapter 5 of Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Last chapter was just updating the title. Hopefully this will be okay. Testing. Okay, so how is this? Okay, I'm getting some red. Turning down the volume on OBS of the mic, so we're not hitting red too much. That attack is a little high. Okay, turning it down quite a bit more. I might have to actually have a threshold, which is wild. Okay. Things look okay. Look okay. Okay, I'm gonna shut that off for frames. I think we're good. Actually, let's look at that again. You know, I think it's fine. So I'm just going to keep this chill DCMA free music on. It might be okay. Just one. Okay. Let's refresh. Things are looking good. So let's get started. So, Chapter 6, The Free Market Paradise Goes East. Capitalist restoration in the former communist countries has taken different forms. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it involved the overthrow of communist governments. In China, it proceeded within the framework of a communist system, as seems to be happening in Vietnam, and perhaps will happen eventually in North Korea and Cuba. While the Chinese government continues under nominally communist leadership, the process of private capital penetration goes on more or less unhindered. Suppression of the left. The anti-communists who took power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989 through 91 set about to impose bourgeois dominance over political and cultural life, purging communists from government, the media, universities, professions, and courts. While presenting themselves as democratic reformers, they soon grew impatient with the way democratic forms of popular resistance limited their efforts to install an unrestrained free market capitalism. In Russia, associates of President Boris Yeltsin talked of the dangers of democracy and complained that most representative bodies have become a hindrance to our market reforms. Apparently, the free market, said by reformers to be the very foundation of political democracy, cannot be introduced through democratic means. In 1992, the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia demanded that their parliaments be suspended and they be allowed to rule by presidential decree, with repressive measures against hardliners and holdovers who resisted the free market reforms. Their goal was not power to the people, but profits to the privileged. This process of democratization via suppression began even before the actual overthrow of communism. In 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, prodded by Russian President Yeltsin, announced that the Communist Party of the USSR no longer had legal status. The party's membership funds and buildings were confiscated. Workers were prohibited from engaging in any kind of political activities in the workplace. 6 leftist newspapers were suppressed, while all other publications, many of them openly reactionary, enjoyed uninterrupted distribution. In U.S. media, and even many on the U.S. left, hailed these acts of suppression as moving ahead with democratic reforms. Gorbachev then demanded that the Soviet Congress abolish itself. It had remained too resistant to change. Actually, the Congress was not opposed to democratic debate and multi-party elections. These were already in practice. It resisted an unbridled free market capitalism and for that reason would have to go. Gorbachev repeatedly cut off the microphones during debate and threatened single-handedly to abolish the Congress by emergency decree. He forced a vote 3 times until he got the desired abolition. These strong-arm methods were reported in the U.S. press without critical comment. What gave Yeltsin and Gorbachev the excuse to pursue this repressive course was a curious incident in August 1991 when a nervous group of leaders, mouthing vague praises about the deterioration of life in the Soviet Union, attempted an oddly orchestrated coup against the Gorbachev government, one that flopped before it ever got off the ground. Weeks later, the Washington Post noted happily that the defeat of the coup was a triumph for the Soviet money class. Among the coup's militant opponents were private entrepreneurs and thousands of members of the Russian stock exchange, who routinely made 20 times the average wage of ordinary Soviets. They headed onto the streets of Moscow to defend their right to wheel and deal. The coup collapsed. Democracy triumphed. Private businessmen contributed more than 15 million rubles to buy food and equipment for the defenders. One broker was struck by how few workers responded to Yeltsin's call to defend democracy. The boldness of the investor class in the face of an armed coup might have another explanation. A socialist critic of communism, Boris Kagarlitsky, argued, in fact, there was no coup at all. The soldiers were unarmed and confused, the tanks were called out undirected, and the leaders of the so-called coup never even seriously tried to take power. The real coup, says Kagarlitsky, came in the aftermath when Boris Yeltsin used the incidents to exceed his constitutional powers and dismantle the Soviet Union itself, absorbing all of his powers onto his own Russian Republic. While claiming to be undoing the old regime, Yeltsin overthrew the new democratic Soviet government of 1989 through 1991. In late 1993, facing strong popular resistance to his harsh free market policies, Yeltsin went further. He forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and any other elected representative body in the country, including municipal and regional councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary buildings, killing an estimated 2,000 resistors and demonstrators. Thousands more were jailed without charges or a trial, and hundreds of elected officials were placed under investigation. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over broadcast media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and presented the public with a new one that gave the president nearly absolute power over policy while reducing the democratically elected parliament to virtual impotence. For these crimes, he was hailed as a defender of democracy by U.S. leaders and the media. What they liked most about Yeltsin is that he never wavered in his support for privatization. Yeltsin, the Democrat, twice suspended publication of the Communist Party newspaper Pravda. He charged it exorbitant rent for the use of its own facilities. Then in March 1992, he confiscated the paper's 12-story building and its press and turned full ownership over to Rossiyski Gazeta, a government pro-Yeltsin newspaper. Yeltsin's elite OMON troops repeatedly attacked leftist demonstrators and pickets in Moscow and other Russian cities. Parliamentary duty Andrei Azerdzis, an independent, and Deputy Valentin Martyanov, a communist, who both vigorously opposed the Yeltsin government, were victims of political assassination. In 1994, journalist Dmitry Kolodov, who was probing corruption in high places, was also assassinated. In 1996, Yeltsin won re-election as president, beating out a serious challenge from a communist rival. This campaign was assisted by teams of U.S. electoral advisors who used sophisticated polling techniques and focus groups. Yeltsin also benefited from multi-million-dollar donations from U.S. sources and a $10 billion aid package from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Equally important for victory was the crooked counting of ballots, as cursorily reported in one ABC late evening news story in July 1996. Yeltsin exercised monopoly control over Russia's television networks, enjoying campaign coverage that amounted to non-stop promotionals. In contrast, opposition candidates were reduced to non-persons, giving only fleeting exposure, if that. Yeltsin's re-election was hailed in the West as a victory for democracy. In fact, it was victory for private capital and monopoly media, which is not synonymous with democracy. even though treated as such by U.S. leaders and opinion makers. Yeltsin's commitment is to capitalism, not democracy. In March 1996, several months before the election, when polls showed him trailing the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov, Yeltsin ordered decrees drawn up that would have canceled the election, closed down parliament, and banned the Communist Party. But he was dissuaded by advisors who feared the measures might incite too much resistance. Though he decided not to call off the election, Yeltsin never committed to turning over the government to a communist if he lost. According to the San Francisco Chronicle. My desk is clear. I need a better lighting in here. There's no real lighting right there. During the 1996 campaign, Yeltsin and his associates repeatedly denounced that a communist victory would bring civil war. In effect, they were voicing their willingness to discard democracy and resort to force and violence if the election did not go their way. Nor was it taken as an idle threat. At one point, surveys showed that about half the population believed that civil war would result if the communists won. Although all of this, Yeltsin received vigorous support from the White House and the U.S. media. An editorial in The Nation asked, "What if a popularly elected communist president in Russia had pursued Yeltsin's harsh policies of privatization, plunging his country into poverty, turning over most of its richest assets to a small segment of previous communist officials, suppressing dissident elements, using tanks to disband a popularly elected parliament that opposed his policies, rewriting the constitution to give himself almost dictatorial power, and doing all the other things Yeltsin has done? Would U.S. leaders enthusiastically devote themselves to the re-election of this communist president and remain all but silent about his transgressions?" The question is posed rhetorically. The Nation editorial presumes that the answer is no. In fact, I would respond, yes, of course. U.S. leaders would have no trouble supporting this communist president, for he would be communist in name only. In actual deed, he would be a devoted agent of capitalist restoration. One need only look at how successive administrations in Washington have cultivated friendly relations with the present communist leaders in China, overlooking and even explaining away their transgressions. As China's leaders open their country to private investment and growing economic inequality, they offer up a dispossessed labor force ready to work double-digit hours for subsistence pay, an enormous profit for the multinationals. U.S. political and economic leaders know what they are doing, even if some editorial writers in this country do not. Their eye is on the money, not the color of the vessel it comes in. Since the overthrow of communism, free market right-wing forces in various Eastern European countries enjoyed significant financial and organizational assistance from U.S. finance agencies, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the AFL-CIO's Free Trade Union Institute, a group intimately linked to the CIA, something I did not know, and the Free Congress Foundation, an organization with anti-communist and conservative religious ideals. Communists and other Marxists endured political repression throughout Eastern Europe. In East Germany, the Party of Democratic Socialism had its property and offices paid for by party members seized in an attempt to bankrupt it. In Latvia, the communist activist Alfred Rubix, who protested inequalities of free market reform, has been kept in prison for years without benefit of a trial. In Lithuania, communist leaders were tortured and then imprisoned for long durations. Florida's anti-communist president, Zviad Gamsakardia, incarcerated opponents from some 70 political groups without granting them a trial. Estonia held free elections in which 42% of the population was prohibited from voting because of their Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian antecedents. Russians and other minorities were excluded from many jobs and faced discrimination in housing and schools. Latvia also disfranchised Russians and other non-Latvian nationals, many of whom had lived in the country for almost half a century. So much for flowering of democracy. One-way democracy. More important than democratic rule was free market reform, a code word for capitalist restoration. Alright. Sorry about that. Alright. One-way democracy. More important than democratic rule was free market reform, a code word for capitalist restoration. As long as democracy could be used to stabilize one-party communist rule, it was championed by the forces of reaction. But when democracy worked against free market restoration, the outcome was less tolerated. In 1990, in Bulgaria, capitalist restoration did not go according to plan. Despite generous financial and organizational assistance from U.S. sources, including the Free Congress Foundation, the Bulgarian conservatives ended up a poor second to the communists, in what Western European observers judged to be a fair and open election. What followed was a coordinated series of strikes, demonstrations, economic pressure, acts of sabotage, and other disruptions reminiscent of CIA-orchestrated campaigns against left governments in Chile, Jamaica, Nicaragua, and British Guyana. Within 5 months, the free market oppositionists forced the democratically elected communist government to resign. Bulgarian communists complained that the U.S. has violated democratic principles in working against freely elected officials. The same pattern emerged in Albania, where democratically elected communist government won an overwhelming victory at the polls, only to face demonstrations, a general strike, economic pressure from abroad, and campaigns of disruption financed by the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. sources. After 2 months, the communist government collapsed. Once a right took power, a new law was passed denying Albanian communists and other opponents of capitalist restoration the right to vote or otherwise participate in political activities. As a reward for having extended democratic rights to all citizens, the Albanian communists and all former state employees and judges were stripped of their civil rights. In the 1996 Albanian elections, the socialists and other opposition parties, who had been predicted to do well, withdrew from the election hours before the polls closed in protest of the blatantly rigged vote. Election monitors from the European Union and the United States said they witnessed numerous instances of police intimidation and the stuffing of ballot boxes. The Socialist Party had its final campaign rally banned, and a number of prominent leaders barred from running for office because of their past communist affiliations. When the socialists and their allies tried to hold protest rallies, they were attacked by Albanian security forces who beat and severely injured dozens of demonstrators. Openly anti-Semitic groups, crypto-fascist parties, and hate campaigns surfaced in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Museums that commemorated the heroic anti-fascist resistance were closed down, and monuments to the struggle against Nazism were dismantled. In countries like Lithuania, former Nazi war criminals were exonerated, some even compensated for the years they had spent in jail. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and xenophobic attacks against foreigners of darker hue increased. With the communists no longer around, Jews and foreigners were blamed for low crop prices, inflation, crime, and other social ills. On June 11, 1995, Lech Walesa's personal pastor, Father Henryk Jankowski, declared during a mass in Warsaw that the Star of David was implicated in the swastika as well as in the hammer and sickle, and that the diabolic aggressiveness of the Jews was responsible for the emergence of communism and for World War II. The priest added that Poles should not tolerate governments made up of people who were tied to Jewish money. Walesa, who was present during the sermon, declared that his friend Jankowski was not an anti-Semite, but simply misinterpreted. Rather than retracting his comments, Jankowski spewed forth the same bile in a subsequent television interview. At about that time, placards that read, "Jews to the gas" and "Down with the Jewish Communist Conspiracy" were visible at a Polish solidarity demonstration of 10,000 in Warsaw, earning not a censorious word from church and state authorities. The economic policies of the fascist Pinochet regime in Chile were openly admired by the new installed capitalist government in Hungary. In 1991, leading political figures and economists from the soon-to-be-abolished USSR attended a seminar on Chilean economics in Santiago and enjoyed a cordial meeting with mass murderer General Pinochet. The Chilean dictator was also accorded a friendly interview in Literarnaya Gazeta, a major Russian publication. Yeltsin's former security chief, Alexander Lebed, is a Pinochet admirer. Instead of being transformed into capitalist states, some communist nations were entirely obliterated as political entities. Besides the obvious example of the Soviet Union, there is the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, which was absorbed in the Federal Republic of Germany. South Yemen was militarily attacked and crushed by North Yemen. Ethiopia was occupied by Tigrayan and Eritrean forces that imprisoned large number of Ethiopians without trial, expropriated Ethiopian property, suppressed Ethiopian education, business, and news media, and imposed a systematic enforcement of tribalism in political organization and education. A systematic enforcement of tribalist political organization might well describe Yugoslavia's fate, a nation that was fragmented by force of arms in a number of small conservative republics under the suzerainty of Western powers. With that dismemberment came a series of wars, repressions, and atrocities committed by all contending sides. One of Yugoslavia's first breakaway republics was Croatia, which in 1990 was taken over by the rightist coterie, including some former Nazi collaborators, backed by the armed might of the proto-fascist National Guard Corps, under a constitution that relegated Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and Muslims to second-class status. Serbs were driven from the civil service and police, evicted from their homes, and their businesses taken from them, and were subjected to special property taxes. Serbian newspapers in Croatia were suppressed. Many Serbs were forced from the land they had inhabited for 3 centuries. Still, Croatia has hailed by its Western backers as a newborn democracy. In 1996, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, a self-professed admirer of Adolf Hitler's organizational skills, shut down the independent newspapers and radio stations and decreed the opposition parliament defunct. Lukashenko was awarded absolute power in a referendum that claimed an inflated turnout, with no one knowing how many ballots were printed or how many were counted. Some opposition leaders fled for their lives. Once a rich Soviet republic that produced tractors and TVs, Belarus is now a basket case, with a third of the population living in deep poverty. Must we adore Václav Havel? No figure among the capitalist restorationists in the East has won more adulation than U.S. officials, media pundits, and academics than Václav Havel, a playwright who became the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia and later president of the Czech Republic. The many left-leaning people who also admire Havel seems to have overlooked some things about him. His reactionary religious obscurantism, his undemocratic suppression of leftist opponents, and his profound dedication to economic inequality and unrestrained free market capitalism. Raised by governesses and chauffeurs in a wealthy and fervently anti-communist family, Havel denounced democracy's cult of objectivity and statistical average, and the idea that rational collective social efforts should be applied to solving the environmental crisis. He called for a new breed of political leader who would rely less on rational cognitive thinking, show humility in the face of mysterious order of being, and trust in his own subjectivity as his principal link with the subjectivity of the world. Apparently, this new breed of leader would be superior elitist cogitator, not unlike Plato's philosopher king, endowed with a sense of transcendental responsibility and archetypal wisdom. Havel never explained how this transcendent archetypal wisdom would translate to actual policy decisions, and for those benefit, at whose expense. Havel called for efforts to preserve the Christian family and the Christian nation, presenting himself as a man of peace and stating that he would never sell arms to oppressive regimes. He sold weapons to the Philippines and the fascist regime in Thailand. In June 1994, General Pinochet, the man who butchered Chilean democracy, was reported to be arms shopping in Czechoslovakia, with no audible objections from Havel. Havel joined wholeheartedly in George Bush's Gulf War, an enterprise that killed over 100,000 Iraqi civilians. In 1991, along with other Eastern European pro-capitalist leaders, Havel voted with the United States to condemn human rights violations in Cuba, but he had never uttered a word of condemnation for rights violations in El Salvador, Colombia, Indonesia, and any other U.S. client state. In 1992, while president of Czechoslovakia, Havel, the great Democrat, demanded that Parliament be suspended and he be allowed to rule by edict, the better to ram through free market reforms. That same year, he signed a law that made the advocacy of communism a felony, with a penalty up to 8 years imprisonment. He claimed that the Czech constitution required him to sign it. In fact, as he knew, the law violated the Charter of Human Rights, which is incorporated into the Czech constitution. In any case, it did not require his signature to become law. In 1995, he supported and signed another undemocratic law barring communists and former communists from employment in public agencies. The propagation of anti-communism has remained a top priority for Havel. He led a frantic international campaign to keep in operation 2 U.S.-financed Cold War radio stations, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, so that they could continue saturating Eastern Europe with their anti-communist propaganda. Under Havel's government, a law was passed making it a crime to propagate national, religious, and class hatred. In effect, criticisms of big money interests were now illegal, being justifiably lumped with ethnic and religious bigotry. Havel's government warned labor unions not to involve themselves in politics. Some militant unions had their property taken from them and handed over to compliant company unions. In 1995, Havel announced that the revolution against communism would not be complete until everything was privatized. Havel's government liquidated the properties of the Socialist Union of Youth, which included campsites, recreation halls, and cultural and scientific facilities for children, putting the properties under the management of 5 joint stock companies, at the expense of the youths who were left to roam the streets. Under the Czech privatization and restitution programs, factories, shops, estates, homes, and much of the public land was sold at bargain prices to foreign and domestic capitalists. In the Czech and Slovak republics, former aristocrats or their heirs were being given back all the lands their families had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, dispossessing the previous occupants and sending many of them into destitution. Pavel himself took personal ownership of public properties that had belonged to his family 40 years before. While presenting himself as a man dedicated to doing good for others, he did well for himself. For these reasons, some of us do not have warm, fuzzy feelings toward Václav Havel. Colonizing the East. Once the capitalist restorationists in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union took state power, they worked hard to make sure that the new order of corporate plunder, individual greed, low wages, mindless pop culture, and limited electoral democracy would take hold. They set about dismantling public ownership of production and the entire network of social programs that once served the public. They integrated the erstwhile communist countries to the global capitalist system by expropriating their land, labor, natural resources, and markets, swiftly transforming them into impoverished third world nations. All this was hailed in the U.S. corporate-owned press as a great advance for humanity. The former communist nations are being recolonized by Western capital. Most of their foreign trade is now controlled by multinational corporations. Like third world countries, they are increasingly deprived of each other's markets. The once heavy and mutually beneficial commerce between them has been reduced to a trickle, as their economies get tied into the investment and extractive needs of global capitalism. Instead of mutual development, they are now experiencing the maldevelopment imposed by global monopoly capital. Multinational corporations are moving into Russia to exploit vast oil and natural gas reserves and rich mineral deposits at great profit to themselves with little benefit to the Russian people. Over the protests of U.S. and Russian environmentalists, U.S. timber interests, with financial support from a venture fund sponsored by the Pentagon, are preparing to clear-cut the Siberian wilderness, a region that holds 1/5 of the planet's forests and is the habitat of many rare species. All aid to the former communist countries is funneled into the private sector. As noted in The Guardian, the hundreds of millions of dollars spawned by Western aid programs have mainly benefited the Western companies, which headed east to board the aid gravy train. When Romania inaugurated an over-the-top market for trading privatization shares, the $20 million startup costs were largely covered by the U.S. Agency for International Development. In 1996, the International Monetary Fund extended a $10.2 billion loan to Russia, with terms calling for the privatization of agriculture and other state-owned assets, and the elimination of human service and fuel subsidies. U.S. aid is used to help private investors buy public properties and extract publicly owned raw materials from Eastern European countries under the most favorable investment conditions. With the advent of private investment in the East, production did not grow as promised but dropped drastically. Hundreds of the more attractive and solvent state enterprises have been privatized, often given away at token prices to foreign investors, while other state firms are decapitalized or driven into bankruptcy. Between 1989 and 1995, what is now the Czech Republic, nearly 80% of all enterprises were privatized, and industrial production shrank by 2/3. Privatization in Poland caused production to shrink 1/3 between 1989 and 1992. Vast electronic and high-tech complexes in East Germany employing tens of thousands of workers have been taken over by giant West German firms and then closed down. Under privatization, much of the former Soviet Union's scientific and technical infrastructure is disintegrating, along with its physical plants. Since going private, CIL, the huge Moscow plant saw its production of trucks slump from 150,000 to 13,000 a year, with almost 40% of the workforce laid off. In April 1996, the remaining workers petitioned the Russian government to take back control of ZIL. In the past, ZIL workers and their relatives had unshakably safe jobs at the factory. They lived in apartments and attended schools provided by ZIL. As babies, they spent their days at the ZIL daycare center, and when ill, they were attended to by ZIL doctors. "I was raised in a country that cared about its workers," said one machinist who now was sorry he had opposed that system. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, "Privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies." Macedonians seem more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. They complain about how work has taken over their lives. No one has time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself, only time for making money. Agricultural output of grain, corn, livestock, and other products plummeted in the former communist countries as thousands of cooperative farms were forcibly broken up. The new private farmers have small plots, often cannot get loans, seeds, fertilizer, or machinery, and are rapidly losing their holdings or reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives have been one sector of the socialist economy that performed well. But with privatization, farm output tumbled 40% in 1993. A drastic deterioration in agricultural production occurred in Bulgaria, once considered the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, causing severe bread shortages by 1996. Bulgaria was also suffering from a 20% monthly inflation and was sinking into that familiar cycle of foreign debt, cutting back on services to qualify for IMF loans, borrowing to pay off past borrowing. The Bulgarian government must impose a more free market austerity measures to get vital international loans to repay portions of the $9.4 billion foreign debt. In 1992, the Lithuanian government decreed that former owners and their descendants could reclaim property confiscated during the socialist era. As a result, tens of thousands of farming families, about 70% of the rural population, were evicted from land they had worked for over half a century, destroying the country's agricultural base in the process. Much production in East Germany was dismantled to prevent competition in West German firms. This was especially evident when collective agriculture was broken up to protect the heavily subsidized and less productive private farms of West Germany. Without making compensation, West German capitalists grabbed almost all the socialized property in the GDR, including factories, mills, farms, apartments, and other real estate, and the medical care system, assets worth about $2 trillion, and what has amounted to the largest expropriation of public wealth by private capital in European history. The end result of all this free market privatization in East Germany is that rents, once 5% of one's income, has climbed to as much as 2/3. Likewise, the cost of transportation, child care, health care, and higher education has soared beyond the reach of many. East Germans of various political stripes have a number of complaints. A. The net money flow to the West has been east to west, in what amounts to a colonization of the East. B. The free market is a myth, but West German economy is heavily subsidized and fully regulated, but against the interests of the East. West German police are much more brutal than they were the East German police. D. If West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as it forced the East to socialize, it would be a totally different country. On that last point, it should be noted that German officials are bringing criminal charges against those who collaborated with the GDR of East Germany in any official capacity, including even teachers and minor administrators. Emigres from communist states are astonished by the amount of bureaucracy they find in the West. 2 Soviet immigrants to Canada complained independently of each other that bureaucracy here is even worse than at home. East Germans living in the West were staggered by the flood of complicated forms they had to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, and bank accounts. Furthermore, because of the kind of personal information they had to give, they felt more observed and spied on than they were by the Stasi. Soviet Jews who immigrated to Israel during the Cold War era experienced a similar disillusionment with the difficulties of life and lack of idealism. The discouraging letters they sent home were considered an important factor in the drop in immigration from the USSR to Israel. With the capitalist restoration in full swing, the peoples of the former communist nations had ample opportunity to learn what life was like in the free market paradise. Their experiences are detailed in the next chapter. And that's the end of chapter 6. And with that, I'm going to take a break.